Welcome back to Easily Explained, where today we will be talking about social behaviors. So let's get started. So what are social behaviors? Social behaviors are interactions of two or more organisms in the same species. So an example of a social behavior would be altruistic behavior, which, if you don't remember from the last video, is when one animal disadvantages themselves to benefit the entire species or to benefit a certain individual in that species. And it would also be in a highly social group. And today we're going to be going over more about the different groups. One would be social group, one would be non-social group, and the third will be solitary animal. So those are the three different groups that we're going to be going over, and we're going to be going over their definitions and also the advantages and disadvantages of all three different types. So let's start with the solitary animal. So as the name suggests, a solitary animal spends most of its life in solitude. So it's alone. And I say most of its life because offspring obviously still stay with their parents until they're independent. But right after they become independent, they're driven away and the rest of their life will be spent by themselves. They display no social behavior other than to breed. And from the definition of social behavior, basically that means they don't interact with any other members of their species or any animals other than to breed with them. Some examples of solitary animals would be tigers, some types of snakes, and bears. Some advantages of the solitary animal is that if a resource becomes limited, it is more likely to survive because it doesn't have to worry about feeding anybody but itself. So there won't be any competition or anything where it has to share its food. It gets that entire resource to itself. And it's also less likely to catch a disease if it doesn't interact with species and it doesn't live in a very crowded, compact area full of many different animals. But some disadvantages of a solitary animal is that there's less protection from predators because being in a group means that there's many different animals to look out for predators or to attack when a predator is there. So it's less likely for one animal to be attacked because there's so many others, whereas a solitary animal only has itself. So if a predator is after it, it has a higher chance of succeeding. And it's also sometimes more difficult to reproduce because it's more difficult to find another animal of that species who is also in solitude. Now we're going to be talking about non-social groups. Non-social groups do not interact with each other socially and they don't connect with each other, but they're still technically in a group. So each animal is still acting for their own benefit. So you won't see anything like altruism or kin selection in non-social groups because they're not going to disadvantage themselves for another member of the species. But they still require that protection of the entire group, and we'll get on to that in the advantages and disadvantages of non-social groups. Some examples of non-social groups are schools of fish, sheep and other herding animals, and flocks of birds. An advantage of a non-social group is that you will get protection from predators, and you'll be able to move around and feed without much worry about predators attacking. Since it's still a group, so there will be more likely that one organism will spot a predator. But a disadvantage, again, it's still a group, so disease can spread. It might not spread as rapidly as groups, social groups that we'll learn later on in the video, interact much more socially together, but they're still technically living in a group and they can still contract diseases from that group. The last type of group we're going to be talking about is social groups. In social groups, organisms do interact socially, and they interact and act for the entire species and their benefit. They cooperate to achieve common goals, and so these groups are where you normally see things like altruism and kin selection, because they disadvantage themselves to benefit the entire species. And social groups are also where you see social hierarchies and resources distributed in a certain way to maintain a social structure. Some examples are groups of ants, bees, and elephants. Some advantages: we get the same predator protection. Since there are more organisms, it's less likely that a specific organism is going to be attacked, or there is more protection in the sense that more organisms, so they're more likely to spot the predator. It's also easier to mate, select a mate, and to breed. There's a division of labor, so the one animal doesn't have to do all of the work, and it can be a group effort. And it's also a rich learning environment because the animals can learn from other animals in that same species. And the disadvantages are, once the group gets to a certain size, there's going to be more competition and less resources, which means that less animals will get those resources and less will survive. And also, if a disease spreads, it's going to rapidly spread. And also, when we talk about disease, we're also talking about parasites. So if a parasite enters an organism, it can spread through the entire species, and then the entire species will be affected, rather than if it was a solitary animal. It would be, first of all, less likely to contract the disease and spread it to others. Congratulations! You are now an expert at social behaviors. I hope this video really helped, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye!